investing in property makes sense. Investing in the right property takes knowledge. Welcome to the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. I'm Jarrod McCabe, Director of Wakeland Property Advisory. Join me for expert insights into the fundamentals, trends and opportunities to help you create long-term wealth through smart property decisions. Hi everyone and welcome to episode 37 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. So I thought today we could step away from the Melbourne property market and get a bit of an idea as to what's happening in a different city around Australia. So today we're focusing on Sydney, and I'm very fortunate to be joined by one of Australia's most well-known and highly regarded property commentators and buyers agents in Veronica Morgan. Veronica is the founder and principal of Good Deeds Property Buyers. She co-hosts the popular series Location Australia and Relocation Australia on Foxtel's The Lifestyle channel. She also co-hosts Your First Home Buyer Guide podcast and the Elephant in the Room podcast with Chris Bates. Welcome, Veronica.
Well, thank you, Jarrod. Always good to chat to you.
So I just wanted to have a bit of obviously our podcast is based considerably around Melbourne and what we do down here, but it's always good to get a different perspective on things and how things are going around the rest of the country. But I don't really want to focus too much on COVID. We'll focus more on what the market's doing this year. There's been enough talk around that. But just to give a bit of an overview, what happened in Sydney over that sort of 2-year period, 2020 and 21?
Well, we were fortunate in that throughout the lockdowns, we were able to still work. And that means go and look at properties and didn't have any problems with getting inspections or getting inspectors, building inspectors, et cetera. I quite liked that period of time because it was quite nice having to slot in your 5-minute inspection.
Yeah. Far more targeted, wasn't it?
Oh, it was very targeted. It was interesting, though, because it's not a long time to spend looking at a house. We often joke that people spend more time looking and researching a fridge than they do a house, but this sort of put that onto perspective. But, we were able to obviously get back for second looks and whatever once we'd established whether it was right or not for a client. But things continue ticking over. And in a way, interestingly enough, it's sort of the social proof aspect changed. You go through a busy open house and there's this frenzy and buyers feed off, they feed off the energy. When obviously you didn't have that when you've got this long lineup of 5-minute inspections. And it's almost like it retrained buyers in some strange way, because then the agents were loving this cloak and dagger negotiations. Yes. Loving it. And, of course, it got us into the space of having to do online auctions.
Yes.
Which nobody had liked doing before. And, and I thought, I remember the first one that we did, and I was like, right, I really have to think this through because, everyone knows, I think anyone who's ever listened to anything that I do or write about, that auctions are a bit of a pet subject for me. So I was like, how can we bring our advantage into the online auction space? So that was a challenge, I have to say. And we did have to bid differently, and you're looking for different signs and some of those bloody platforms too, that they give you an extra 5 minutes, the highest bids.
Yeah, and it took a long time for them. I don't know how you found it, but certainly early days, the technology side of things and the different forms, so all the different types of platforms and whether or not you could see other people on the screen, and different agencies had different requirements as to whether or not you had to have your screen on or whether you could bid blind. It was really unusual.
I know, it was a bit nuts. And, I thought the Zoom ones were the most bizarre, just watching, I position myself when I'm at auction to look at other bidders.
Yep.
I don't really care too much what the auctioneer is doing, whereas most people position themselves to watch the auctioneer. Now, so in Zoom, when you get all these people's faces and then they turn their screen off at certain strategic times, I just found it fascinating.
Yeah,
but anyway,
it was very different.
Yeah, we're back to normal now. But I think what also happened in terms of, we're all locked in, whether you're in Melbourne, you couldn't get out looking at property, or whether you're in Sydney and you could get out looking at property, we're still locked in for significant periods of time. So it was very interesting to see what happened at the end of 2020 when I can't remember exactly when we came out of lockdown now, but I always had this sense that when people are locked up inside their own four walls for any period of time, if that property is in any way unsatisfactory, or if they really hate their family and they want more space,
Yep.
They would come out like greyhounds chasing a bunny around a track,
Yep.
and that's exactly what happened. So it was very quick, and we were a bit tentative in those sort of first weeks. I think it must have been August when the first on-site auction I went back to, 2020, casting my mind back now. We were very tentative in terms of, well, what does this mean for competition? What does it mean for the market? What does it mean for prices? And it didn't take long for us to see that this is going to be strong. We could feel it.
Were you coming off the back of a strong finish to 2019 like Melbourne was? I think that's part of the reason why Melbourne, when it did have the opportunity to transact, that the market kept on going well. I always wonder what would have happened to the market if we'd been fairly dormant and quiet the back end of 2019 leading into 2020.
Yeah, 100%. So I think we have very similar sort of timing with our cycles, Sydney and Melbourne. Sydney peaked middle of 2017. The mid, whoops, no Siri. My watch has decided to talk to me. We definitely, following the election, mid 2019, we felt a change, and that started biting in September that year, and it did come strong into Christmas, which is very unusual. Usually in spring there's an influx of stock, but that was like 2 years of pent-up demand when you think about it.
And the clearance rate normally drops in spring too, and I really noticed in 2019 it just didn't drop, it just kept growing and growing.
Exactly. Yeah, we had exactly the same situation. So then coming into 2020, we had ridiculously high, in fact, I track all this stuff, I've got it all in my computer here, but we had, just don't have it open, but we had ridiculously high, I think we were in the 90s.
Yep.
Oh, maybe that was last year. Now it's all a big blur now. We had a very, very strong start to 2020. There's no doubt about it. In fact, clearance rates, I definitely remember, were well in the 80s, right up to the beginning of March. And then, of course, from the 14th of March onwards, it went, bong.
Yeah, it changed drastically.
But you're right. I think so. I think, therefore, that it fed off that. But you know how sentiment can really take a bashing, and regardless of whether there's a good opportunity or not, they just won't buy. That could have happened too. So I think that even though there was that leading into it, I still do think being stuck in your house, if it wasn't big enough, I think and it changed people's thoughts about what they require in their home.
All right, so looking at this year, what changes have you experienced? Obviously, interest rate rises and the global uncertainty around Russia and the Ukraine and things is proving a bit of an issue. But when you've had 2 years of pretty strong growth as well, there's always likely to be a correction of some sort. So how is the Sydney market shaping up, or how has it shaped up thus far and looking into spring?
Yeah, well, the beginning of the year was still quite strong. And look, retrospectively, when you look at CoreLogic data, it shows very clearly that Sydney peaked in January. And certainly we had seen, obviously, the trajectory of that growth rate, the steepness of that had eased off in the latter half of 2021. So you knew that it was there was sort of energy coming out of it a little bit. But certainly in February, we still had a lot of pent-up demand. And I'm sure it's similar in Melbourne, in that you've got the Christmas period because it's auction-oriented. And look, I know the whole of Sydney is not auction-oriented, but, they're sort of the more expensive, and the inner ring certainly is. The clearance rates held up very well against a high degree of new stock coming on the market.
Okay.
And that's because there's also a pent-up demand amongst buyers, people who haven't been able to buy at the end of last year, and it was a ridiculous year to try to buy property, 2021. They've taken a hiatus, that there's been a good 6-week period where really there's no stock coming on the market because you can't run a full auction campaign with Christmas in the middle.
Yep.
And the holidays. So there's all this pent-up demand. Now, it didn't start to come out really till, March was relatively strong, and then you sort of really start tapering off quite steeply. And look, that in itself is no strangeness because you've got Easter and things, the school holidays,
April's
and blah, blah,
right
blah.
off.
But you definitely saw that, obviously the commentary around the RBA raising, deciding to raise rates, and that happened in May. And so there was this sort of preemptive, lack of confidence or a decline in confidence, shall we say. And you can definitely see that in auction clearance rates, and you could feel it on the ground as well. But you know what I find there's two sort of anomalies that we've experienced. And one is that normally when the market goes down, when the press is negative, and it started in 2021, let's face it, with all those bank predictions, and normally when prices do start to come off the boil, you will suddenly see a marked decrease in people going through open houses.
Yep.
But this time round, we have not seen that. We have, and I will preface that by saying we also on the ground are looking at A-grade properties.
Yes.
I know that the agents are complaining that Bs and Cs are struggling.
Yeah.
But the A-grade properties, even they are very busy open houses. And even though not always buyers aren't necessarily prepared to compete, certainly not as hard as they were competing last year for the same type of property, but it's really interesting to think, even if they're not doing anything, there's an interest there.
Yeah.
Because normally when the market falls off in Sydney, if the market falls off, people aren't interested in property. They won't even go to the neighbour's auction.
Yes. Okay.
So that's the first anomaly. And the second anomaly is that CoreLogic data has shown that the top 25th percentile has fallen the most. And I can honestly tell you, I've got some clients with some pretty decent budgets, and those markets, and once again, I guess it's biased because I'm only looking at A-grade property, but I'm not seeing a huge amount of softening in that end.
Okay. And is the stock level still reasonably strong in that sector, or is it is that coming off a bit too?
Well, that's always it's
always a tough one. Yeah,
it's never easy to buy good property, really. So definitely we've seen a reduction in stock levels. One of those markets, and so that's sort of the North Shore of Sydney, that market, a lot of the agents in the bigger family homes, the agents there in particular are saying that they've got quite a good spring that they're looking forward to in terms of listing levels. So that should be interesting to see how that bears out.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you, in terms of one of the things that we've started to notice this year is that we are really starting to see more investors coming back into the marketplace. Are you seeing anything along those lines up in Sydney?
Yeah, we are. Be interesting with the, Queensland's land tax.
Yes.
All of a sudden the southern states will start looking at attractive again.
Yeah.
But no, we are seeing much more investor activity. Do you know what's interesting in Sydney, though? I think there's a perception, and it's fair because it is the most expensive city in Australia, and there's a perception amongst a lot of investors that, you don't buy in the most expensive suburbs or you don't buy in the most expensive city, so there's no value. But, value is relative, of course.
Yep.
So it is quite interesting because usually, the majority of investors who aren't that educated about property will chase what they perceive to be value, and they'll go for affordability.
Yep.
And so you don't see that sort of investor sentiment, I guess, reaction in Sydney, whereas you might in other maybe in some of the regional centres, perhaps in Geelong and Newcastle and Brisbane for that matter, and Adelaide, you would see investor activity as potentially as a barometer of something else, or some level of confidence.
Yep.
Generally, whereas Sydney does behave differently.
We're seeing it at the moment. I think there's a number of reasons for it. I think interest rates have certainly played a part, but I think the significant reduction in the vacancy rate from a rental market point of view is certainly encouraged. It's starting to really show some positive signs and give investors confidence that they haven't had for the past 2 years because the rental market's been so soft that they have got confidence that they'll be able to secure good quality tenants. And the vacancy rate's not only dropping, but rental figures are now not just back up to where they were pre the pandemic, they're actually starting to exceed it in certain sectors as well.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. And then that helps, obviously. But, I guess the thing is in Sydney, we were looking at period of time, not that long ago, pre-COVID obviously, but where you'd be happy if you got a 2.5% yield.
Yeah.
Pretty bad. But then you have to offset that with your growth, you're
correct, exactly.
Choosing a growth asset, but it is pretty bad when you look at cash flow and you think, I've got to be able to fund the difference.
The interesting thing, other thing I wanted to check in with you on, again, comparing, trying not to directly compare, but looking at how Melbourne and Sydney are similar and different in certain ways, is that the apartment market here, and we've done a number of podcasts, I did a webinar with Stuart Weems recently as well, around the apartment market performance, and it hasn't been as good as in Melbourne in recent years as we would have expected. But I don't believe that's the case in Sydney. It's been, the apartment market's done reasonably well over the pandemic time. It's
a very interesting topic, and released one of my little rant videos recently on this, actually, because apartment data is so difficult to rely on when making decisions, right?
Because there's such a different type, isn't there?
Well, there's just so much in it. You've got to be able to pull it all apart and understand what it is you're looking at. So we haven't had the same issues with oversupply in Sydney that you've had in Melbourne and also in Brisbane. But we do have some pockets of extraordinary supply, all of it awful in my view. I would never be going there, not with my money nor with my clients. And we have seen, like, to give you an example, it's almost like it's like a metropolis out at Mascot near the airport.
Yep.
So that's on the southeastern side of Sydney. Now, when all of that stuff was coming into completion, it really had an impact on the rental market far and wide.
Okay.
There's so much stock coming on,
yep.
and lots of rental incentives, and brand new with whatever. And so, like, I would talk to property managers in Bondi, for instance, who's saying, well, yeah, we're losing tenants to go and rent these huge brand new 3-bedroom apartments.
Wow.
Because it's so much cheaper, et cetera, and it's brand new and no one's ever lived in it. Whether those people end up sort of coming back to Bondi and places like that or not, I don't know. But so it's the first time I'd ever really experienced a ripple effect in terms of impacting tenancies and vacancy rates that extended quite some distance. I mean, Bondi is not close to Mascot.
No, not at all.
And so, in a way, I feel like that probably contributed. That's one example of what had contributed to Sydney's terribly low vacancy rates for a period of time, and really sucked a lot of tenants out of the market over in that direction. So, and then, so of course, but an owner-occupier who wanted to buy, a place in Bondi Beach, well, they don't really care what rent they're going to get or not get, because they're not going to rent it out. So, but it's sort of funny how it had this sort of knock-on effect for a bit. So I have to say that there's been a period of time, the whole cookie-cutter type of idea of apartments, we know that they don't perform. And there's been no surprises in Sydney. Those apartments haven't performed here either. But where you've got, in a beachside suburb where there's a finite amount of apartments and land, where there's a finite amount of properties with views, where you're looking at warehouse apartments, Art Deco, where you're looking in the inner city suburbs, say Potts Point and Surrey Hills and places like that, there's a lot of garbage stock everywhere. But
yes.
The good stuff really, really has done very, very well because of its scarcity. But then what we also found last year in particular is that with houses, because this boom that we just had has been an owner-occupier housing-led boom. And then it's basically the ripple effect down through the property types and price brackets. And so that started getting into into apartments. So people started then saying, well, I can't afford even a 2-bedroom cottage in the inner city now. I'm going to have to, or a 3-bedroom, I'm going to have to pivot to an apartment, or I'm going to have to move out out the burbs.
Yep.
And so we really saw all of a sudden some of those more unique, the better apartments, some crazy prices.
Right.
And it's like, bang, it was like automatic. When I say automatic, it was like overnight, bang, everything in that ilk suddenly just went stupid.
Wow. Yeah, so that's really different to down here. That's really interesting.
So, and then we saw that ripple down too. So it started with the 3-bedders, then it started with the big 2-bedders, and all the cookie cutter stuff still wasn't going to get those prices, but there'd be a little bit of a spillage into that, I guess. And then we saw the oversized 1-bedders, because of course 1-bedrooms were so on the nose through lockdowns.
Yep.
But the big ones started, so ones where people maybe have moved to the country, moved up and down the coast.
Town base.
Want a town base. They want decent living space, decent storage space, all that sort of stuff. So your 60 square metre 1-bedders, they started going crazy. But it was this sort of, it was like tick, one segment went crazy, then
you could see it coming and almost set your clock by it. Yeah, right.
It's like watching the bushfire come towards you.
Which, again, so the interesting part there is that we haven't seen that as much. And I just wonder whether or not, you mentioned there that the lockdown on had a real impact on that 1-bedroom market until that flow-on effect really kicked in. I think that's been a big thing because our lockdowns were so much more extensive than what the rest of the country were. I think that apartment mindset, or the fear of being locked up in an apartment for an extended period of time has really played out. And a lot of people have rather than maintaining their lifestyle and looking to, if I can't afford the little house, the terrace house in the inner city, I'll go to the apartment. They've actually looked more at going further out because of those lockdowns and at the time not necessarily feeling as though they need to access the city anymore because there's so much working from home. And so that's what's led to a lot of movement to the outer suburbs, but also to the regional areas and obviously up into northern New South Wales and into Queensland as well, which again was another question. Have you noticed or seen it all? And we haven't yet, but I'm expecting it to come about at some stage, almost a reverse tree change, sea change, where people who have made that move coming back.
I literally bookmarked an article I saw on LinkedIn today on that, and it's a joint venture between CBA and the Regional Development Association or something, and I haven't read it yet. So because I absolutely anticipate a U-turn, and I know not only because I'm some demographic expert, which I'm not, but because I do understand human nature, and I also know that certainly when we were filming the show, travelling all around Australia, it's really interesting talking to real estate agents who work in regional towns, and particularly coastal areas, because that seems to have that happen, where people would do this sort of sea change, and then the amount of reversals. So, and there's some areas they would say up to 50% of people would turn around within a year and want to go back.
Wow, okay.
So and these are nice areas. It's just that when they get there, it's not the holiday vibe anymore,
Well, I've had this discussion. I mean, me being from the country as well, I know what it's like living in a regional area, and I could very comfortably go and do it tomorrow, but my wife couldn't. It's not her cup of tea. And I know a lot of people made the change during the pandemic, probably brought things forward, so perhaps had planned to do it in a 5-year time frame, and this brought it forward. But there was others that made it more on a knee-jerk basis, and they're the ones that I think are far more likely to reverse at some stage.
Yeah, because, sure, lockdown might have been nicer in the regions, but, as we can see, this, our governments are pretty, well, the whole world is getting used to living with, rolling bouts of COVID. We're probably not, I don't, barring another pandemic, which, hey, that could happen, let's face it, I don't think that we're going to have a lockdown every year, you know, and I think when people sort of get used to that, and it's interesting, I was talking to somebody who lived on the South Coast, and she said, she dropped her phone and cracked the face of it. Even this little thing like that, she'd drive for an hour, take it to a store, and then, and then when it's fixed, has to drive that's 2 hours, hour there, an hour back, had to go another 2-hour journey to get the phone back. And it's a small thing, but it's all the conveniences that we're so used to and just take so for granted in the cities. You don't have, and you've got to plan better. You've got to think things through a lot more. Your friendships, your connections. There's a whole lot of things that change, and I think also with this rental crisis, people have not had the opportunity to try before they buy.
No, that's right. And that was a lot of people did jump into that down on the coastal regions. I'll lease out for 12 months and keep my house in the city. So people who got in quickly were able to do that. But some of the rental prices and things that have been paid in some of those coastal or tree change type locations were just astronomical during the pandemic. Yeah.
So there's sort of, and also, and some of those towns, I've wondered if there has been enough of an influx of a younger demographic with kids and the whole palaver. They have a whole need. Social needs are different. Their infrastructure needs are different than what would have been there previously. And so I guess if some of those towns have enough of that, younger cohort there, and those things do change, great. But as we all know, these things aren't sort of things that change overnight. And, families may decide that they're not getting the support or all the things that they require, in terms of living there. So, or that just, their general, they've brought down the average age far too much, and they feel it's not really their groove anymore.
Yeah. All right. Well, just to wrap things up, what are your expectations for the spring market in Sydney? What are you seeing? What are you thinking you're expecting to experience for your clients?
Yeah, very good question, because, and I'll preface what I'm going to say by saying that typically Sydney is very seasonal. I think it follows a similar pattern to Melbourne.
Yep.
And although less so to some degree because our winters aren't quite as hard. so you've probably got slightly less of a decline in winter listings. And so normally what happens is in September, when everyone sort of gets the idea that, spring is the time to sell. I still can't believe that that's a real spring selling season. It's actually not if you want the best price for your property normally, right? So,
that's another podcast we can do.
Well, yeah, don't want to be selling when everyone's selling. That's sort of not the point. But anyway, so there's this pervasive belief that spring is the time to sell. So in most years, what that happens is, you mentioned earlier, clearance rates start falling off. Buyers start thinking, this is fine. I can just sit on my hands now. I've got choice. And so any sense of urgency comes out of the marketplace. Prior to COVID, right, so prior to 2019, there's only been 2 years, and I've been in real estate now since 2000, there's only been 2 years where that hasn't happened, where basically the market went straight, full pelt right up to Christmas.
Yep.
And that was 2007 and it was 2016. Now, in both cases, the following year was the end of the boom.
Yep.
So, 2008, we all know we had GFC. Now, I don't know if they're necessarily linked, those two things, but certainly in 2016, the market had been showing signs of running out of steam, but had been bolstered by a couple of interest rate drops.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that was the last ditch of an overshoot of a market at the end of 2016. Now, the same thing did happen in 2019, but as we discussed, the circumstances were different.
Yep.
And it was coming off the back of 2 years of downturn. So this year, big question, I'm seeing that buyers are returning. There seems to be a renewed, even though confidence officially is down, in my segment of the market, I think people have the wherewithal to still buy property. So what about rising interest rates?
Yeah.
They've got the wherewithal, whether it's because they've got a lot of equity in the property they've got and they're upgrading, or they're deciding to invest. I see that people are prepared to say, okay, I'm prepared to go ahead and buy, either upgrade or invest. And I find that interesting because there's all this data out there to suggest that shouldn't be the way people are reacting. But I think we're also looking at aggregate data, and there's a lot of first home buyers and a lot of people who haven't benefited through this period of time that we've had the last couple of years. But I think people who already own property and they've benefited from that uplift in value, I think there is a wealth effect that is not necessarily being communicated, or it's not necessarily making its way into the confidence data. And so I'm seeing anecdotally, and a lot of brokers are telling me this too, that they're actually seeing increase in inquiry. But I'd fully accept that is within a very middle class segment.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm seeing. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, agents are saying stock's coming on. So I don't know how that'll play out, whether it'll just tread water and we'll continue to have, clearance rates sort of hovering around 60% as a balanced market. Perhaps that will be what happens.
Yeah, look, it's very interesting times. I mean, it's certainly significant. Well, from our perspective, it's a very different market to what we were experiencing 12 months ago. But I certainly don't think it's as negative as what some would have you believe.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And I've mentioned earlier, I started real estate in 2000. I've been doing it now, 22 years. This is the time when I'm finding it harder to read what might happen. The signs are different. They're pointing in different directions. So I don't know. And I know your message is very much similar to mine. It's probably the same, really. It's like if you buy a quality asset, you buy with the long term in mind, and you also understand your own personal numbers and cash flow and all the rest of it, then you just buy when you're ready, but buy when you find a good asset. I mean, there's no point I know that there's some bargain hunters out there at the moment. I'm like, well, you're still not going to get a good asset as a bargain. I mean, you might luck it, but it is luck.
Yeah. If you go to a good quality asset, whether it's an auction or expression of interest, whatever it might be, expecting to pick it up for a bargain, you're just not going to. Whereas if you go there with the mindset of I'll do what I need to within reason to buy this property, you may be fortunate enough to get it for a bargain, but it won't be to do with the property. It'll more than likely be to do with something that's happened during the campaign that's made it fall into your lap.
And on that, we do pay particular attention to what agents are quoting for property.
Yep.
Because the ones that accidentally, and I say accidentally because they don't deliberately set out to overquote, but every now and then you'll get one that's overquoted. And we do love those ones.
Yep.
Because this is quite an unforgiving market for the agent who gets the pricing wrong.
Yep.
And, we could have an whole other podcast on underquoting as well. But the problem is that underquoting that's the way the market operates.
And it's it's very sensitive at the moment too. If buyers don't see value at the moment, then they'll just move on to something else.
Yeah. Exactly right. And the problem is buyers are part of the problem.
They are. Yep.
Because they do that, then the agent who wants to quote the right amount of money can't because they're not doing the right thing by their vendor. It's always running rings around and trying to sort of bring in. It's a
chicken
nightmare.
and egg. It's chicken and egg sort of stuff. It really is. It makes it really hard to. I mean, you'd love to be able to say, well. And I work with an agent down this way who's very, very keen on disclosed reserves. It's his mantra, and he's been very strong on it for a long period of time. And I think it's got its merits, but it also, a vendor, if you sit on their side of the fence, also needs to reserve the right that if the campaign flies, then they need to be able to change their expectations.
Exactly. I think it's very naive to set your price at the beginning of the campaign. I think that's. Yeah, it's not sophisticated in my view. I really like the South Australian version, and if anyone likes to hear me bang on about this, I will bang on till the cows come home. This is so clever, and it is that the reserve cannot be more than 10% over the guide. So the agent and the vendor can't collude to underquote.
Yep.
It's beautiful.
Works well.
And if they increase the quoting throughout the campaign, then the reserve gets, to be adjusted accordingly, as far as I understand. So, that's the only way to do it. And then you don't even have to worry about the Office of Fair Trading having to go through all the various documentation to try to prove or disprove whether they were underquoting or not. It's very easy to take the two documents and put them next to each other.
You can see. Yeah, exactly right. All right. Well, thank you very much, Veronica. I really appreciate you joining me today, and I'm sure the listeners will. I'm sure. And if anyone would like to listen to Veronica further, on her podcast that she does with Chris Bates, Elephant in the Room, is fantastic. So make sure you jump on whichever podcast provider you enjoy and look it up because there's some fantastic content on there as well. Thanks, Veronica.
No worries. Thank you.
So thank you very much for joining Veronica and I today for episode 37 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. As always, I'd love you to share the podcast far and wide with any friends, family and colleagues who may have an interest in property. And if you would like any further information, feel free to visit our website wakeland.com.au, and we wish you all the best with your property decisions.